All right, welcome to today's training. Our topic is basic and Dolphins class dynamics. In this training, we're going to go over the important things you'll need to know to keep your class running smoothly so that you'll be able to run your Dolphins class in a way that will maximize turns as well as help give them the repetition they need for their training to provide them the pace of skill development that we're expecting in our program. Also, it helps you understand how to utilize the lesson plan and stay within the skill level and make sure that every child gets the theme in their lesson so that they know that when it's back to school week, they know it's back to school week, and they get to enjoy the excitement and activity of that lesson. So as in always, dynamics or levels, safety is our first priority. So it's important to enforce all the safety rules all the time. There's 5 safety rules posted in the pool room. It's important to make sure that you go over all 5 of those rules every class. Okay. The number 1 rule is to make sure that no student gets in the pool without a coach. It's important that you also follow those examples. The number 2 rule is that the students have to listen to the teacher and follow those examples. The rule number 3 is that the student needs to wait on step 1 for their turn. Rule number 4 is that the students should walk while they're in the pool room, and rule number 5 is that they be nice to each other. You can go over those rules one at a time, like or all together at the front like I did, or you can allow them naturally to come up during class and then fill in the remainders as you go through. Okay? We're going to go over the 3 fundamental rules for coaching that are really important, because those are important for how you run your class and the function of your class. So anyhow, back to our training. 3 fundamental rules of safety for the teacher to abide by. Number 1 rule for every instructor is keep your eyes on the class. The lesson plans and the skills are all lend themselves to this possibility. For one, most of the things that you do or demonstrate in class, you can do it just facing your class. The second thing is, if you're not actually facing your class all the time, for instance, if you're talking directly eye contact with in your class, if you're focused in on one student, you want to make sure that you're doing scanning so that you're looking. If you're scanning your class every 1 to 3 seconds, you're scanning appropriately. So it's literally like a tennis match. Like, yeah, who's ever been to Sunsplash or like Raging Waters or whatnot, right? You see the lifeguards there? Their head's always like, right. Now, you don't have as like a general area to scan. You got your kids, you got 4. You can do some of the lifeguard no-nos, like count how many kids you got in your group, right? Stuff like that. But, they tell you in lifeguard training, don't count, because then you're obsessed with, am I counting right or not right? You're scanning for those, like, what's sticking out, what's not supposed to be here, right? And what's unusual, what behavior looks like it might be dangerous, that kind of stuff, right? You're doing a similar thing in your class, but because you're primarily responsible for your own class, your scanning can be focused in more on your class. Occasionally, though, I want some of your scanning to be the whole area. Okay, there could be a student that wanders around behind, or not a student, but a child spectator that wanders behind. This is more of a safety thing, but it's always important, since safety's first, to remind you of the importance of scanning the whole room occasionally, making sure we're watching out for our spectator patrons as well. Okay, you're primarily responsible for your class, but that doesn't mean that we're not all ultimately responsible for everybody in the room, right? Secondly, rule number 2 is stay within the skill level of your class. The coaching safety rule number 2 is to stay within the skill level. For the Dolphins class, the students are going from the intro level, like otters level or minnows level, and in the basic class, they're going from the class that's literally called introductory. All of the introductory levels have the same skills, and that set has them going about 5 feet from the step. Torpedo 5 feet, swim out 5 feet, float for 5 counts. There's a big theme going on there. So when they get into your Dolphins class, if you have a student who just got in there from one of those levels, they just graduated in, or anybody who was evaluated to be in your class, somebody who might not know exactly what their skill level it is, how far should you be able to expect they can swim already? 5 feet, right? That's your expectation. So remember that when you're teaching your Dolphins class, you might already have students in that you know can swim across the pool. When you get to the new student you don't know, you're going to need to come a little bit closer and say, hey, how about you swim to me this far, and then we'll see how far you can swim. Even if they're telling you, no, go ahead and move back. Say, okay, well, I'll tell you what. If you get to me and you want to keep swimming, go ahead and I'll just walk alongside you until you need help, okay? And then you can more safely assess where they're at. And also, it avoids a situation where you might just spook someone from being in that level. A child who goes in the level and then suddenly they think you're too far, they can't perform, might then be inhibited from performing at the level for the rest of the skills, and then you might have the feeling maybe they've been misevaluated, maybe they should not have graduated to my level, but really they were just spooked because you stood too far away than what they're used to. And so it's important to start out close enough to give them confidence in your new level. Okay, that's part of what it means to stay within the skill level of your class, is understanding where your students come from as well, what that expectation is, as well as where you're trying to lead them to and what that max is. Okay, that's staying within the skill level of your class. The skill levels are defined by what document? Nicole, what document defines our skill level?
Skill sheets.
Yay! Skill sheets, right? Skill sheets are what define the skill levels of the class, okay? And that's what defines the program, basically, what class is appropriate for a student to be in and where they should move to. So staying within the skill level means to abide by the skills that are prescribed in that skill sheet, okay? What tells us specifically what we're going to do for that day's lesson? Yes, the lesson plan. Thank you. So the lesson plan tells us specifically which skills we're going to work out. Typically, you'll see specific skills and how far you go, etc., in the lesson plan as well. But it's important for you to remember that the lesson plan is a specific guide about what to do that day, and the skill sheet is the skill level, staying in the skill level. Now, sometimes the lesson plan will say to work a specific skill that all of your students have accomplished, or a skill that one of your students has accomplished everything except for one lateral to that skill. So for instance, maybe they can already do speedboat, but they only need to pass off torpedo and back float. Okay? Well, if they only need to pass off torpedo and back float when the lesson plan says to do speedboat with the kickboard, you might do speedboat with the majority of your class who's still working on that skill, but when it comes to that one student, what skill will you do? Which one, Ruben?
Torpedo.
That's correct. Yes, because you want to substitute in the skill that's appropriate for the student, because it's still in the skill level and it's in the same skill set as speedboat, but it's working the specific skill that that student needs to pass, right? Because they only have a few skills left. You want to make sure you're hitting on those skills in the lesson so that that student has an opportunity to progress, as well as the ones that maybe haven't accomplished the skill that's specifically written in the lesson plan. Okay? So even though the lesson plan is flexible, it's not meant to be disposable. Okay? Important class dynamics is remembering that. The lesson plans are flexible. In other words, you can substitute skills in. They're not disposable. I don't want you to just go through your advanced level class doing, okay, we're going to do kicks, we're going to do this breathing drill, we're going to do our timers, and then that's a class because that's what's going to make you get all these skills and go. Well, what happened to the theme? It got tossed out, right? And so even though some of the skills are flexible to substitute in there, I don't want you to think of that as the lesson plans being optional, okay? Super, super important when you're running your class that everybody gets to experience the theme that it is that week, okay? And they get to experience it with your interpretation, of course. I want your personalities in there. So rule number 3 is take responsibility for safety, okay? Take responsibility for safety. We're gonna, for instance, if we need to do zip line, I don't recommend, nor do I really approve of, the method of just telling your class get up out of the pool and then walk around, follow student A all the way around the pool. Inevitably, there's one student who wants to be student A, and they'll race up to be ahead of them, and the student A is like, they said, follow me, so they race up, and you might create the situation which I'm asking you to avoid, which is your students might start to run on the deck rather than walk. And you're not in a position to really control that. You're in a verbal position to yell at them all you want. Walk, walk, well, hey, hey. Okay, but that's not always going to create the result you want. What will always create the result you want is to get out of the pool and to lead your class from point A to point B, or at least be with your class as they go from point A to point B. That allows you to actually be responsible for whether or not your students are running or walking when they're supposed to, okay? So take responsibility for safety means that your actions are determined by what will make a safe environment. Fundamentally, if we cover nothing else, that's the most important thing to me, right? Okay, I don't care how many parents quit because they feel like we're crummy at teaching kids to swim. As long as nobody drowns, I'm going to sleep at night, okay? A parent can yell at me all day long about how crummy, I'm doing a job teaching kids, okay? Maybe I'll lose sleep that night, maybe, okay? But it's important, super important to put what's first, and that's the safety of those students, okay? Now we're going to move on to how do we not have parents yell at us because we're crummy, okay? All right? And that's basically some main bullet points that are going to carry us. Pace is one of the important things to keep your class on track for learning. Challenge is another element. Authority, or being in charge of your class. Now remember, during the trainings, right, I said make everybody read that training word. We're not trying to force the students to learn, right? Okay? That's not what I mean by authority. What I mean by authority is being the person who has the plan. Okay? Being the person who's in charge of directing what's going on. If you don't give that image of that you know what you're going to do and you have a plan for what's going to go on, then your students are going to start, there's more likely your students aren't going to go along with that plan. They're going to make up their own things to do, and lots of times it's mischief. So pace, challenge, being in charge or having the authority of the class, and having fun. Those are the key elements to keep your class on track for learning, okay? Now, let's start with pace. Pace is super important because the minimum amount of turns each student should get in class is 16 turns. That's with 4 students and basically 5 activities now. You used to divide the class into 4 activities, but with the swim safety we've incorporated 5. Now you got 5 activities, 16 turns. Believe it or not, it's quite challenging to make sure that every child gets 16 individual turns in a class in 45 minutes because you want to make sure they're getting something out of those turns, and there's an amount of time in between, like your turn's done and now it's your turn to go, and those kinds of things, making sure everybody understands what to do. So in order to keep that moving so that the students get that repetition, your focus has to be on the students who are cooperating, who are paying attention. That's a real key element to keeping the pace of your class, because every time your attention is distracted by a student who isn't doing the right thing, the pace of the class changes and slows down, and a lot of the attention, because the attention of the class goes then onto the student who's not doing the right thing. And if you keep the attention focused on what you're expecting, focused on the students who are doing what you're expecting, then you keep the pace of the class moving the direction toward what you're expecting. And that really goes a long way to helping the pace of the class continue smoothly, okay? And I would say, majority, 51%. Obviously, you can't have 51% of 4, so you're going with 75% of 4, or 2/3 of 3. You're going to go with the majority. If half your class is paying attention, 1 out of 2, we'll keep going with the 1 and then help the other catch up when it's appropriate. Wait for a natural pause. In order to do this, you need to wait for a natural pause in the turns to redirect the attention of students that aren't paying attention. So in other words, if a child is starting to edge their way off step 1 and you want to keep reinforcing that rule, and your old teacher look like this, didn't sit them back on the step, right? You wait until you're done with the other child's turn, if you can, if the kid hasn't plopped all the way off, and right? But if they're just edging their way off, they've got off the step, but they're sort of just edging their way, you can finish your turn with the student you have. Then remind the other student to stay on step one, even if they're the very next student you're supposed to call for their turn. Okay? So you take your turns, and you don't want to interrupt every turn with, oh, Sonny, Susie, stay on the step. Johnny, don't do that. You want to do your turns and then redirect that behavior. Take your turn. Hey, wow, great job. Hey, Susie, make sure you're on step one. Hey, so that a majority of your attention during class is on the students, on what's supposed to be happening. Okay? The more attention you can pay on what's supposed to be happening, the more you increase the activity that's surrounding what's supposed to happen. Okay? The length of each turn should generally not exceed the pass-off for the skill. Okay? So, for instance, minnows float for how long? 5 counts, right? Now, we've increased it for the Dolphins class. How long should dolphins float? 15. Now, let's say you got a dolphin who's still a little bit like they start floating, they get past that 5 point, and then their body's like just going out of shape. They start lifting their legs, they start lifting their hands, they start lifting their head. You want to encourage them back into the position, but not for any more than the remaining 10 seconds of their turn. Okay? So, if you start counting, you get to 5, they start changing their body position, you're like, go ahead and relax those legs. Legs down, lay flat, lay flat. And that took about 10 seconds for them to get back into that position. Yay! Turn done. Okay? You don't then resume counting 6, 7, 8, because you're extending the length of that one child's turn, perhaps by something that might elevate their level of performance. However, it could also cause them to become more anxious about their turn. If they were moving out of their position, it's usually because their anxiety level starts increasing at that point. And if you can just simply help them maybe work on getting back in the position, or sometimes I don't even do that. I let them float to 5, and I say, wow, great job. And then I say, hey, that was good. You had your legs laying down, and you were laying in the water for 5 counts. I use up the remaining 10 seconds just reinforcing the stuff they did well. Okay? And then go to the next child's turn. If you do it unevenly, where like you get them all in that position, take all that time, then resume counting, you're going to get to the next student who maybe can do it the whole 15 counts in a row. Yay, good job, 15. Their turn was 15 seconds. This person's turn was 45. Okay? Is this kid paying more money for the class than this kid? No. That's a disproportionate amount of time you're spending with one student or another, that's just not appropriate, because they all pay the same tuition. Okay? So you don't want any one student's ability or inability to monopolize your time and attention. That's both for their behavior and their skill level. Okay? You want every student to get equal time for their turn, regardless of how that time is spent, whether it's getting them up to the point where they can attempt the skill, whether it's getting them to the point where they've done part of the skill, but then they're moving up to the next part, or they're completing the whole skill. Each student should get the same amount of time of your turn. That's another important way to keep the pace of your class going smoothly. So the rule here is the length of each turn should generally not exceed the pass-off for the skill. If the pass-off for floating is 15 seconds, then the amount of time you spend with each child's turn shouldn't exceed more than what it takes to start their turn, do 15 seconds of instruction, and then end their turn. Does that make sense for everybody about that? Right? It's the same for every level, but it is especially true for dolphins as well as the other levels, because now their turns are taking longer. So it's really important that you still can work in the amount of turns necessary to get progress. Okay? The amount of time each student gets for a turn should be less than 30 seconds from the time they get off the step till the next student's turn. Okay? So that's including instruction and etc. And this is a length a bit longer than the previous class. I tell you to keep it down to about 15 seconds for minnows and otters. 30 seconds is double that time. How do I give double the time but still ensure the same amount of turns for everybody? How do I do that? Any ideas?
I missed the question.
How do I give double the time, allotted time for each student's turn, but still ensure the same amount of turns per student that I was in the previous lesson? The previous lesson, minnows and otters had 15 seconds per turn recommended, and then the dolphins is 30. Well, every minnows and otters should be getting 16 minimum turns, and every dolphin should be getting 16 minimum turns. How are we going to do that with double the length of time for each, double the duration? How are we going to do it?
We could go to 5 feet for dolphins.
Okay, you could shorten the length of each turn so that they're not swimming as far. But that would still shorten the amount of time they have. And I'm saying you could go to 30 seconds. So how do you do that? Good, it's new information for you. Ready? Mind blower. You can have more than one student going at a time. Okay? So you got twice the kids going. That's how they get the same amount of turns as the minnows, even though their turns take longer to do, is you have more of them going at a time. All right? That's the thing you keep in mind. You got to try to figure out a way. Now, the pass off, let's give a little example here, okay? Because you got to keep safety in mind, right? So we're going to go to an important way to do this for some of those things. Like for dolphins, what's the pass off for their forward swim? Forward swim. Do you remember?
20 feet.
Yes. Across the pool, 20 feet. That's the pass off for dolphins, is all the way across the pool. So if I'm telling you their turn shouldn't exceed the length of the pass off, which is all the way across the pool, how do they get back to the step? Right? And so now I'm telling you, take their turn shouldn't exceed the length of their turn. Now they're going to come back. Right? So how do you do that? You had a clue in the first one. I'm going to go to your first answer. Tell us again how I might do that. So not 5 though. 10, because it's half. So half is to you, half is back. Half is to you, half is back. Half is to you, half is back. You can do multiple dolphins that way. I mean, you might start out 5 for some of the kids because they just got out of minnows and otters, right? So they're just doing that 5 feet and back, 5 feet in and back, because you're challenging them up to the dolphins level. Now, when you can work them up to halfway and back, and a lot of kids that move out of the minnows and otters, they can go well beyond that 5 feet, because 5 feet is somewhat arbitrary. It's just the minimum what they got to do. Most of the time, that's the first thing a lot of kids can pass is once they are starting to get close to passing off is they can move out that 5 feet, great, and by the time they get to dolphins completing all the rest of the skills, they can go 10 feet pretty comfortably. Okay? So if they can go 10 feet comfortably, but the rest of the way is a struggle, where is the most dangerous part of the skill for them? On the way out or the way back? The way back, right? So that's where your eyes have to be especially. Not necessarily on the student who's coming to you, but the one who's going away for your safety, for their safety, right? The one who's going away back to the step. Now, so that's one way you can do it. You can get students to do the full length of their turn, and yet also make sure you're getting a lot of repetition, because you can have one coming to you, one back, one coming to you, one back, and they're swimming 10 feet to you, 10 feet back. That, in essence, is the full 20-foot pass-off. Now, you can't just view that and say, yay, they stopped at me and swam back, pass, right? Because that's not actually what the pass-off is. It's a great way to build the skill, but it's not what the pass-off is. To pass the skill, you have to see them actually swim from point A to point B. It's a good idea at one point in your class to go ahead and go one at a time. Swim from the step all the way to the other side. Most of the time I do that early on. I get the kids a little warmed up. I do a swim or two to me and back. Then I say, who wants to try all the way across? Me, 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 me. Okay. And if they don't all say me, 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 then I just go individually. When it's their turn, I say, hey, do you want to swim to me or do you want to swim all the way across? They say, I want to swim to you. Okay, go. They swim to me and then back. I want to swim all the way across. Cool. They go. They swim all the way across. I could let them swim all the way back and just keep a good extra close eye on them, but that's going to drag out the pace for my class. So instead of having the students swim all the way across and all the way back because of how long it drags out the turn, once they swim all the way across on a turn in the Dolphins level, then I'll carry them while I talk to them about their turn. I'll actually carry them about halfway or sometimes more depending upon how much they struggled to get all the way across, so that I can know two things: they'll make it safely all the way back to the step and make it in a timely manner. And while I'm carrying them, I'll give them feedback on their turn. Wow, those were great kicks, or I saw your arms go up in the sky, or I didn't see your arms go up in the sky. One of those things, so that they can then get some feedback on their turn. And I'm also doing that while I'm carrying them midway. I don't drag that out because, once again, the whole reason that I'm doing this, well, not the whole reason, but a good portion of the reason is to keep the pace of the class moving. So I carry them, give them feedback, then tell the next student, get ready, and go. And then the one student I had carried completes the rest of the way back to the step while the next student starts their turn out to swim all the way across. Then I take that next student, carry them midway while I'm giving them feedback, get the third student ready for their turn, and go. And that student swims back while the very next student then swims all the way across. And then I keep repeating that cycle for the remainder of the time set aside for that particular skill practice before moving on to the next skill for the lesson. That way I get a chance to build up the endurance and skills for the students to reach the pass-off level of swimming all the way across, and I can work in turns for them to swim all the way across without it consuming a large amount of time. After all, some of the students can make it all the way across, but it takes them quite a bit of time to get there, and so I can give more turns for the students to accomplish that all the way across swimming and keep it moving that way and keep it safe, because I want the students to be able to make their way across and make their way safely back to the step. Remember to keep your eyes on the students who are most likely to be struggling, which likely is going to be the student finishing their turn. But don't take anything for granted. Always keep your eyes both directions. Remember, safety is first. Another important thing to remember for keeping the pace is that Dolphins, a lot of Dolphin students can take turns safely with up to two students at a time. You can even have them both swim to you if you can safely manage holding them or having them hold on to each of your arms while they turn around and then swim back, rather than the alternating. You can circle swim if you can have them do that safely, where they go across to the other side, move over, and then you're gonna carry them a portion back and they swim the other direction. It's like what I just spoke about. But I want you to use common sense. So you don't want to go two at a time if you're feeling distracted by maybe what the theme of the lesson plan is, or something going on in the pool, or you're just not feeling on top of your game that day. Don't put the students in danger just because I said that it's possible that don't feel like you're obligated now to make sure that it's happening all the time. Also, children of mismatched abilities shouldn't really be taking turns at the same time. If one student's really going to be going slow and the other student's zipping all the way across the pool, you have to be able to keep your attention on both of those kids, and you're probably going to assume the one who can maybe make it all the way across is going to be safe, but if they're not, you're going to be torn between which student to rescue first if both of them end up in trouble at the same time and your arms are not long enough to reach them both at the same time. So it's always good to make sure you do students of matched abilities when you're pairing them up, so that you can be basically in the vicinity of both students in order to provide the assistance when needed. And sometimes it's just not possible because of the skill level of a particular class. Maybe they're all brand new Dolphins, or they're all Dolphins that are struggling at that particular skill. And so you're going to need to go back to making sure they're only going one at a time, because safety is way more important than any amount of skill progress you're going to give if it elevates that level of danger to be unacceptable. And I want you to use common sense. I can't give you a logarithm of when it becomes a danger. You need to be using your own sense of judgment and making sure that you're only doing multiple turns when it is safe for you to do so. But I want you to understand that it is likely you're going to have a lot of instances where you can have two dolphins taking a turn at the same time. The last point of note is that no matter what level, there is only one student at a time on the raft. There's just too big of a possibility students are going to crash into each other and collide if they both stand up at the same time on the raft, or one goes off one side and the other off the other side, and you have a large raft in between your students. One student could get under the raft while you're paying attention to another. So never have more than one student at a time on the raft, no matter what their level, except tadpole tots, and that's because each of those students has their own adult supervision. They have their own adult with them accompanying them. So tadpole tots is the only exception. The only other exceptions might be in the lesson plans where you actually have one student on the raft and another student kicking while holding the raft. Those are also two different scenarios, which are maybe a more appropriate risk level, and also is prescribed exactly how to do that in your lesson plan. So as a general rule, you only have one at a time on the raft, even in the Dolphins class, but also as a general rule, for most of the other skill turns, you can work some way into having two dolphins go at the same time. I don't recommend more unless it's an activity right at the step, like blowing bubbles or practicing your side breaths or things like that, or pop-up breaths for them. If you have any questions at any time about appropriate times to have your students have multiple students taking turns, make sure you talk to your mentor or your manager about that. Challenge. Challenge your students. Now, challenging your students is important because a blanket statement of challenge them may sound like I'm asking you to make it hard for them. But that's not exactly true. Obviously, if you don't ask them to do something a bit beyond what they've accomplished, then there can't be progress, right? You have to be a little imbalanced in order to walk forward, kind of a thing. So it is important to make sure that you appropriately challenge your students. And this is for two reasons. One, because they're going to more likely build steady progress if each challenge builds on the accomplishments they've had. And the second reason is that you're going to be able to build better motivation in your students for trying to accomplish harder skills because they're feeling accomplished as they go, and the progression makes logical sense for them. So appropriately challenge is an important key word. And how do you keep that appropriate? How do you appropriately challenge them? So there's a couple of factors to consider, and three that I want to emphasize. Appropriate. So what is an appropriate challenge? An appropriate challenge matches the class skill level. So you never challenge a class with a skill that's beyond the skill level of the class. Okay? You also should avoid challenging the class to skills that are below the level of the class. You want to keep it sort of really at that spot where just at that beginning prerequisite up to the graduation requirements. So that's the area in which you're appropriately challenging your class. That's number one factor, is it appropriate for the class level. The second factor is for the child's skill level. You have students, there's a range, in every level there's a large range of skill requirements to pass off, and a large range of abilities of students. So it's important to make sure that your challenge is appropriate for the particular student that's having a turn. So you can do turns where you say, I want to see how fast you kick for your skills. And that's an open-ended challenge and can meet the abilities of every student's levels. So there's benefits and detriments to using open challenges because they're so non-specific. One of the detriments is that it doesn't create that same sense of accomplishment that a specific goal does for a student on a turn. So one of the benefits though is that it's inclusive. So you present a how fast can you kick, and every student gets in their own mind what that means to them and works at it. So more than likely, though, your feedback for each of those is going to be, wow, is that your fastest kick? And then the student answers you, yeah, and you say, wow, or they say, no, and you say, well, I want to see you kick your fastest. So that's, an open-ended challenge. I recommend that you maybe start with open-ended challenges and then build towards something specific so that you can meet that appropriately challenging the child's skill level. The last or third factor that I want you to take into consideration when considering what's appropriate is a child's motivation, which can also be interpreted to mean their tolerance for failure. So people are motivated to try at things that maybe they're not sure they can accomplish as long as they think that they probably will accomplish it eventually. So you want to keep challenging your students to goals and skills that they feel they're likely to accomplish. Now, how do you know what they feel likely to accomplish? That's going to be an important part of how you decide what is appropriate for challenging your students. So students will have a difficult time answering a question if you say to them, what's appropriately challenging you? So you have to read their body language. Some of the things that students will do are what tell you whether or not they're motivated. And sometimes you have to still use a little bit of detective work to figure out which type of direction you need to go with the challenge, whether you need to make it harder or easier, because the reaction from the student can look the same. Students that are feeling overwhelmed because you're over challenging them will often feel like they can't be successful, and so then they will become like a rag doll, and then for some skills they start out just being really motivated, and then you notice their determination sort of drops, and then their body language is telling you they're no longer willing to try. They go limp because they're feeling like, whatever you tell me to do, I'm obviously not going to do it good enough, so why don't you just give me my criticism now? Okay? Why don't I just lay down and do nothing because you're going to talk to me the same way? All right? You didn't do it good enough, here's what you can do better. Those are kids that are often telling you, I don't want you to tell me what I'm doing wrong, I want to succeed at something. So those three factors, what's appropriate for the skill level, what's appropriate for that child's skill level, and what's appropriate for their motivation. Okay? Other kids will exhibit the same behavior, lay down, do nothing, because they're bored and not challenged enough. You're doing too much for them. This happens in the levels where your child is doing a lot of swimming on their own, and then suddenly they're like, won't kick, won't scoop. Well, you're holding on to them. They don't need to. They don't need to. So you got to ask yourself, which side of that coin am I going to try out first? Am I going to try challenging them more or challenging them less, right? You could take a guess, but you could also just ask the student, okay? When they accomplish a skill on their next turn, you say, hey, do you want to do the same challenge or do you want it to be a little bit harder? Okay? Then you start to gauge their level of tolerance for failure. If a student who barely accomplishes a skill comes around and you're like, you want to do the same challenge or you want to make it harder, and they say harder, maybe their tolerance for failure is high. But we don't know yet. Try out a harder skill, then give them the choice again. If they fail at that, and then you come back around and say, do you want to do the same challenge or do you want it to be easier or harder? Right? Or if they fail at it, you can be same challenge or easier. Let them pick. No, same challenge. I want to beat this one. Then you know where you're going with the student, right? If they say, oh, easier, then you know where you're going. You know what that level is for that student, so you don't squish their motivation. If we just guess, it could be a lot of guessing before we reach what's the truth, and by that time it may have changed why they're not doing it anymore. They might be just doing it now because they don't like you anymore, because you've had a hard time with them, and now you got this baggage, of like, now I'm getting frustrated with you. Oh yeah, well, I don't like you anyway, and and that kind of thing starts to interfere with the original problem, which just was they were either over challenged or under challenged. Okay, to really keep your class going smoothly, find out that sweet spot, and it's by surveying. You want it to be easier or harder, or the same, okay? And then they'll tell you. And then you get a good idea for each student, what their personality is, what their level for failure is, why. And you rarely have motivation issues like those things where the kids won't do it, or they're like, mad or whatever because they can't do it, or they're self-critical. They try a skill and fail, and they're like, You have less of that dynamic because you've been able to keep the challenges appropriate, right, for them as a student. Another thing to keep in mind when you're challenging students is that you never spend more time negotiating with the child for their turn than what it takes for them to do their turn. Like, you don't want to spend 30 seconds negotiating with the Dolphins student about, now you can swim this far, you can swim this far. You could have taken 2, 3, 4 more turns with them, slightly shorter distance, and convinced them better that they could swim farther than you would have just saying, I'll be right there, I'll help you, come on, you can do it. So it's really important to eliminate or reduce or restrict the amount of time you spend negotiating. If it takes more than just, go ahead, I'll be right there for you. If they don't go right after that, they don't believe you. And in order to believe you, you've jumped too far, okay? In order to believe you, you have to progress them at a pace that the bites are the right size for them, okay? For most students, what I like to do is start with where they're confident going right away, and then I just increase that distance as long as they're not noticing that I'm scooting back. Now I don't scoot back during their turn, but before their turn starts, I'm a little bit further back than they were before. Because if I scoot back during their turn, it's sort of deceptive, and they trusted I was going to be there, and then I moved back, and then they're like, I don't trust you anymore. I'm saying move back in between turns. So this turn I say go, next turn I say go, next turn I say go, next turn I say go. If they go without noticing I've moved back, that's fine, that's good. That's a good challenge of appropriate steps to progress them, okay? If they start noticing, I say, oh, well, last time I was right here, now I'm just going to be here. Can you go now? If they're like, no, then I'm like, okay. Bullet number 4, be in charge. The students, they should have a clear understanding of your expectations, okay? It doesn't have to be authoritative in order to be assertive. It doesn't have to be authoritative in order to be clear, okay? I had a teacher one time that said, well, how much do you sugarcoat? And I just tell them this, the only thing that should be sugar-coated is candy, okay? Because when you're trying to tell them for their own safety, you need to be up there on step 1, it cannot sound like a game. It cannot sound optional. It needs to sound like something they need to do, right? But when you're saying, hey, swim out to the teacher, it should sound like something they want to do, not something they have to do, okay? That's the difference right there. Your instructions that are for safety need to be commands, make them commands. Your instructions for teaching need to be encouraging. They should be encouraging, so they need to be encouraging, right? So therein is how I want you to be in charge, is you make sure that when you're giving instructions, they sound like instructions. When you're giving encouragement, it sounds encouraging. Your students will be able to make a clear distinction of those things, and you won't run into any class dynamics where your kids are just out of control, okay? Because they'll understand that you're in charge. Hey, I know when she means me to sit on this step. She says, sit on the step, okay? I know I'm not a she. Anyhow, so when they know the instructor means business, right? So they'll know what you mean by the way that you say it. A lot of younger students don't have the same vocabulary level as an adult, so they're not always absorbing everything you're saying in the way that you intended. So they're making up their mind about what you're saying based on a lot of other input other than the words that are coming out of your mouth, right? So that's why it's important that your body language reinforce that. Your body language is encouraging or commanding depending upon what it is you need to do, right? And importantly, it's important to remember these things. Your students can only expect you can only expect your students to return to step one at the end of their term and sit down at step one if that's what you're telling them to do. If you've always implied it, just because I went over the rules at the start, everybody knows this is where you wait for your turn, but you don't say it to them frequently during class as just instruction, not just only when they're in trouble, then it's a poor expectation to have for them. It's more appropriate to expect they're going to behave because you're giving them that instruction. Okay, hey, your turn's done, go wait on step one, right? Go sit on step one. It's so-and-so's turn next. So it's important to make sure that you're doing that for them. Also use signals for the start and stop of each turn, the person's turn. It doesn't have to be hand signals, but those are really helpful on days when it's very noisy, right? Go and stop and, go faster. When I do this, guys, it means faster, right? You can have other signals, but it's especially important to have a signal for when their turn starts and when their turn stops. My most common recommendation for the signal of when a child's turn starts is what?
When you say their name.
Yeah, you call their name. Thank you, Nicole. That was very sharp. When you call their name, okay? When you call their name, that's the start of their turn. That way you can reinforce that with the students who are having a little trouble with being patient enough to wait for their turn. You remind them, I didn't call your name yet, please wait on step one. It helps that safety time for when you need to spend a second or two, like, oh yeah, following up on a student, the next student thinks it's their turn and they go already. You want to be sure your eyes are on all the kids, right? So you don't want them to start their turn without you, okay? So when they're named, so you use their student's name to tell them for their turn. What's the signal for when their turn's over?
When they've been reminded to be on step one?
You tell them, your turn's over, okay? That's the most fair way to do it, right? That's my signal. I say, your turn's over. Go back to step one. Sometimes your turn's over to some kids are like, what? My turn's over, why? Right? You say, oh, good job, sit back on step one. So it could be to tell them to sit on step one, right? That's when you tell them their turn is done, okay? And if you have a consistent signal so they know when their turn starts, when their turn ends, then you have fewer issues of children that are confused about that or challenge that, right? Tell them what is and is not appropriate for swim class. This is a key phrase that I use for things rather than telling kids I don't like that or that's good or bad. I tell them if they're doing something like, okay, so kids play games with their parents that they shouldn't play in public, like if parents will come up and go, look at that cute tushy, and pinch their kid's butt. And then you got a kid in class waiting for their turn to get rinsed off, and they're like, look at that cute tushy to the kid in front of them. Oh, that's just not appropriate for swim class. I'm not telling them it's bad. Then they're going to be like, my mom's bad, It's, they're not understanding. Or if they slurp water up in their mouth and like, on the kid next to them, ha ha ha, that's the way me and my dad play when we swim in our pool, right? That's just not appropriate for swim class. Or I say this, that's not swim school manners. That's not swim school manners. Maybe you play that game in the pool with your dad, but that's not swim school manners, okay? That's an easy way to help the child understand that yes, they can do this and no, they can't do this without them automatically feeling bad or in trouble for what they're doing. Because some of what they're doing isn't stuff they should be in trouble for. It's just stuff they thought they were having fun, but it wasn't appropriate. So they just need to be informed of that. They get the right information and they can make a better choice. So oftentimes if they feel in trouble or bad for what they're doing, then they just feel bad. And instead of thinking, oh, I should behave differently, they're thinking, I hate that teacher, or I'm bad, or this is no fun. And that's not what you need them to be thinking. You need them to be thinking, well, what is appropriate and what's not appropriate? Well, next time I just won't water at somebody because that's not what you do in swim class. Okay, now I know. Once they know, if they continue to repeat the behavior, then they're just being defiant and that's handled differently. You say, I asked you not to do that. You don't do that in swim class. That clarifies it. Okay? Then they do it again, and you have to say, okay, you're not listening to me at all now. You need to go talk to your mom about listening to your teacher, and you send them out so they can talk to their mom about listening to the teacher. If they're not on timeout, I don't time out kids. I don't sit in the corner kids. Sitting them out of the pool on the edge, if they're a little bit antsy, is not a timeout. It's not a punishment. It's not about being punitive. It's about keeping kids safe. And if they're just not listening to me, I can't keep them safe. They need to go talk to mom about that. Because I'm not a behavior modification specialist. Although you become one through teaching, it certainly might modify their behavior, feeling excluded from class. But my intention isn't to exclude them. It's to be able to include them the most. And the only way I can do that is if I can keep them safe and if they're listening to the teacher. That's my intention. I never want to exclude someone. I want to include them all. But I can only do that within the boundaries of what's safe and appropriate. Right? So that make sure that that's your attitude going through, and then you won't feel frustrated with the students. You'll just be taking appropriate action based upon how class is going and the behaviors of your students. Right? And that allows us to do bullet point number 5, which is to have fun. Okay? The classes are designed to be fun. We can't go through them with like a serious face the whole way through. We want the kids to know that we're happy to be there. We want the parents of the students to know we're happy to be there. And having fun actually increases the conceptual learning centers of the brain. If you're stressed, your higher brain starts to shut down and your lower primal brain starts to take over. Fight or flight if you're under stress, right? Yes. So your primal brain starts to take over if you get under stress, and then your fight or flight reflexes. Kids know they can't outrun you. They know they can't outfight you. And so oftentimes for a younger child facing an adult in a situation, here's what flight looks like. Right? Here's what fight looks like. They look similar. It's the same thing triggering their response. They've been aggravated to a state where they're no longer really thinking conceptually anymore. Their primitive brain is taken over. I got to get out of this. I got to get out of this. Sometimes they actually get up and get out. Those are the kids that feel like maybe I could outrun them, or my mom's right there. As soon as I get to my mom, safe, right? So, that's neither here nor there. I let kids get out of the pool when they need to get out of the pool. If I see a kid like starting to, hey, are you okay? You want to go see your mom? Is it all right? I let them decompress. Okay? Sometimes they do that. I've had kids that look like they're having a fine time, normal class, right? And then they're just like, ooh, ooh, ooh. And I'm like, oh, what's going on? They were being compliant. Even though they really didn't want to do all the stuff you're asking them to do, they were just being compliant. And yeah, you were making them laugh, but they're still kind of nervous because you're a stranger to them. And that all builds up, and then they realize they're stressed. It's really important to keep the classes light, keep the class fun, involve the students in every activity in a way that they feel challenged but not overwhelmed. And sure, once in a while you're going to make a miscalculation on that. Like, oh, that was a little too big of a challenge. Or maybe they weren't quite ready to jump off the raft and totally underwater. But most of the time, it's a quick road back to where he left off if the majority of the time you're using these tools. Okay? So maybe once in a while, a child says, I'm going to do it by myself. And you let them go and they do it by themselves. And they're like, wow, that wasn't what I expected. And they freak out on you. They're more likely to calm down and retrust you again if that didn't happen like their first day in class or their second day in class or lots of times because you always said, come on, you can do it. I'll be right there for you. You're going to have a much better dynamic if you follow all of these things that we're talking about. So make sure safety's number one. Keep the pace of your class moving smoothly. Challenge your students appropriately. Be in charge of your class by making your body language and your words match what your intention is. And then also remember to involve the themes in your class, involve the imagination of your students, let them show off to you, and make it fun for everybody, including yourself. All right? Thank you very much.